Okay, welcome to the second part of manufacturing, um, where we're going to look at where we should manufacture our garments from and the conditions under which we should manufacture garments. But to start off with, let's just watch a brief, lost it, video on how a garment's made, because the process is important in determining which country is most appropriate to make the garments. Okay, by understanding the process, we can then start asking where in the world do we have the people who have the skills to be able to make those garments. And one of the advantages, particularly for developing countries, is that the skills level are not necessarily high for basic garments, which provides what we call a low barrier to entry. Okay, have a look at this picture now. And this picture was taken in 1900 in New York. And New York was the centre of the textile industry for the world back then, because it had cheap wages by means of migrant workers coming in from predominantly Europe into the US. And you had a factory which doesn't look dissimilar to what you find in Southeast Asia now. Cramped conditions. You've got an overseer here watching over what the girls do. You'll notice it's a male, again reflecting the social values of the time. The point of this picture is that industries never stay in the same place, and economies never stay constant. They're always changing. So sourcing from one particular country might be appropriate today, but 5 years from now you may have to look at sourcing from a different country. So you're always working in a globally competitive environment to do so. Also, take note of this person down here, because I reckon that's a ghost. They're not real. So the question is, should we go for a capital intensive or a labour intensive process to make our clothes? If we go for capital intensive, we're looking at something like this Zegna suit from Italy, which retails from between $2,500 to $15,000, made from the finest wool in the world, which happens to be in Australia, versus a labour intensive operation where you've got everyone cramped into conditions making the same product. The type of garment we want to make influences whether we go capital intensive or labour intensive. So we first have to ask what garment, and therefore obviously what target market are we wanting to sell into. Once we decide that, we can start looking at countries, different countries, and we might look at India and say, okay, that lends itself to labour intensive industries, so we might source from that country. Also China fits, I've lost my thing, China also fits into that category, whereas Italy is more capital intensive, and we'll look at the question as to why, or the characteristics of each one in a moment. Again, the point to remember is economies are changing fast, so China's very quickly moving from labour intensive to capital intensive, and certainly for retailers like Target, they've pretty much left China and gone to Vietnam, Bangladesh, because China's too expensive. How do we know who's labour intensive and who's capital intensive? Well, we know by applying the framework of Porter's diamond, which we discussed in the previous lecture. Remember where we looked at the factor conditions, uh, the skills base, the knowledge base, the level of infrastructure in a particular country? That all helps tell us which category a country falls into. So once we look at these countries, we then come back and look at some details as to manufacturing, and we find if we're making a garment for Kmart, for instance, it lends itself to a labour intensive process where the garment's mass produced, lots of garments relatively similar, just pumped out one after the other. Low wages, which means low costs or higher profits, if you like, and consistency in quality. So quality means not high quality, just means it's the same quality, which again is what a Kmart wants. Kmart needs a product which is going to be the first one off the production line and the last one are the same. And that's where your Chinas and Indias have an advantage over, say, Cambodia, which can also fills these three characteristics, but perhaps not that great on that one, or not generally speaking. I'm sure there are factories that do it. If we look at the growth then in exports of apparel, you'll find that 15% in 1995 came from China, of apparel exports to the world, growing to 18%, 26%, and then up to 33%. So China's been, as we all know, the big grower in terms of taking advantage of labour-intensive industries. Turkey, which supplies the European Union, has also grown, but not at a great it's a bit fragmented, up, down, fairly consistent. Bangladesh is growing also, but again, high 2.6, 2.5, 3%, but not as dramatic as China. China's certainly been the country to watch for as it grows. Mexico, which supplies the US market, also going 1.7%, 4.45, but then down to 1.4 because of economic problems at that stage. Again, we note the trend, and we also note that China's probably by 2014 has plateaued, and they're at a point where their industries have to become either capital intensive to scale up to produce more expensive garments but of a higher quality, or get out of the industry altogether. And that's sort of where China is at the moment. So a little bit of uncertainty with that aspect of the Chinese economy. Or the other thing they can do is move inland and manufacture further east where wages are lower, but the problem with that is getting it back out to the port's quite expensive because of infrastructure bottlenecks and delays in transport. So the other option we've got is to go for capital intensive manufacturing, and what you've got here is high startup costs, so you need deep pockets to set up your factory in the first place. High cost for machinery. This is machinery that's coming out of Germany, Switzerland. This is sort of the best, most precision equipment that's out there, and you need skilled labour to operate that machinery, which means higher wages. However, you're going to get more valuable garments coming out. So the garment coming out of that factory could be this print from Dolce & Gabbana, which retails for 1,700 euros, so just a bit over 2,000 Australian dollars. So it's a very different market to that of the Kmart model. Just a matter of matching who your target market is, what the garment is that you want to produce, and which country is most appropriate for it. Okay, if we look at the economic development of a country on this table relative to particular industries, what we've got down here is low value adding and high value adding. So this is a really basic t-shirt at this end. This is your Dolce & Gabbana dress that we just looked at. High value adding, sophisticated prints, processing, fabric, etc. And here you've got low to high level of development of the country. So if we take Japan, and in 1950s and 60s they were producing garments much like the image we saw of New York, and it was low value garments. Then as wages and conditions and education improved in Japan, they started to lose their competitiveness in t-shirt manufacturing and move towards textiles and adding more value in the process in the weaving of the textiles. Also did that with fibres, so they started getting into the fibres and the spinning of them, and finally they sort of left that industry and moved into the making of the machinery that then spun it. Yeah. So what you saw here is a classic transition. A country that after World War II was pretty much its economy was flattened. It started from scratch, started manufacturing garments, and then moved textiles, fibres, and then they made the machines. And the factories that made the fibres closed down in Japan and relocated to countries like Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, always with ownership by the Japanese. And the same process repeated itself. Then when these countries started to become expensive, the owners of those industries said, okay, where are we going to set up the factories? And then they looked around and found the China's, Indonesia, Thailand, and the process repeated once again. So just as I mentioned before, China's now at a point where it has to start deciding whether it gets out of China and goes to Bangladesh, Cambodia or Vietnam, or it tries to move into making textiles or adding or making machinery itself. The point is it's always in transition. It's never static. When it comes to the retail side of things, we find that if we look at the two colors, so the light blue is 2006 in terms of sales value, and 2011 we see a dramatic increase in sales in that 5-year period in the Asia Pacific region. Western Europe's stagnant, North American markets growing a little bit but predominantly stagnant as well. South America growing, Eastern Europe growing, Middle East also growing, and Australia stagnant. So what it's saying is that the growth is all happening in Asia and South America, but it's not happening in the older economies or the more established or developed world. They've pretty much plateaued. And even though this is 2011, not much has changed since then. These markets aren't growing at all. So, if you want a job in retail, Asia's the place you've got to go, not here. But these are all pretty broad brushstrokes in terms of, it's easy to say, oh, China's cheap wages, go there. I mean, China's a big country. So if we look at it from a micro perspective, we can start to look at clustering. And Michael Porter looked at these clusters. And he identified geographical areas where companies were competing against each other, selling into the same market. And for instance, he looked at a lot of clusters in Italy, Germany, and France, I think by memory. But let's take one example: the Lira Valley, just outside of Rome, and this town, and it is just a town; it's not very big, specializes in the production of women's clothing, but just not all women's clothing. It's specific to outdoor clothing. So you've got a town which has a number of companies competing against each other for one niche market. And what Porter discovered is just by the geographic concentration of these companies in one area, you get some really strong competitive advantages by that occurring. If we look at some details of that, where have we got? Actually, before I do that, I'll go back. Where the competitive advantages stem from is, just imagine this: if you work for a company in one of these small towns, it's not hard to bump into your counterpart or your competitor at at the supermarket or at the cafe or whatever, and informally you start talking, and you start talking about your job and what you're doing and what's happening. So those informal lines of communication allow not so much spying, but allows everyone to know what everyone else is doing, and so there's always this greater level of competition. Whereas in a country which doesn't have clusters, such as Australia, you're not going to get that. The only way you get information about what your competitor is doing is usually when they launch the product. You might hear a bit behind the scenes, but it's not so prevalent. Also, in terms of recruiting, you don't have to go through a formal process. You just talk to people at the supermarket, and chances are you'll get jobs that way. So if you look at Italy, which is still competitive, even though it's a capital intensive uh, economy, there's 80,000 companies and over a million or close to a million employees. 13% of economic activity is accountable to the manufacturing sector, which employs some 42,000 people just in that province. Okay, if we do, they ran a bit of a SWOT on clusters in Italy, and you can have a look at those yourself. But we see something similar in Abbotsford in Vic, Victoria of Hoddle Street. um, like in Abbotsford in Victoria Terrace Parade, according to Hannah. Um, but yeah, by having businesses located close to each other, as I said, you get those advantages. So have a look at through those, familiarise yourself with those in general for the test, and just ask yourself whether Australia could benefit by clustering, and whether um, companies that are located closer to each other could, even though we're in a capital intensive country, could in fact compete with the Chinas on a different model.